The photograph is dated June 3, 1891, a warm Wednesday morning in Briar County, Pennsylvania. At first glance, it looks like any other family portrait from the late 19th century. A father, seated stiffly, a mother with her hands folded, 4 children arranged in careful rows, all of them wearing the kind of Sunday clothing families saved for special occasions. But stamped on the back of this portrait, in the official handwriting of the county clerk, is a phrase that has puzzled archivists for decades: recovered after the fire. The strange part is not the label itself. Town records are filled with the marks of floods, collapses, and occasional fires. The strange part is that no fire was ever documented in Briar County on or around that date. Not at the Halloway farm, not in the wider township, not in any report filed with insurers, churches, or local authorities. The paper trail is clear and unwavering. According to every official record, nothing burned that summer. Yet the photograph tells a different story. Its edges show a delicate, almost selective scorching, darkened just enough to suggest heat, but not enough to destroy the image. Behind the family's oil lamp, a faint plume appears, something restorers once dismissed as a flaw in the emulsion. But after magnification, the shape looks too controlled, too textured, too much like real smoke. And then there are the children's faces. Their expressions are unusually fixed even for the long exposures of the time. Their eyes hold something unsettled, as if the moment captured was not one of calm, but of waiting. The portrait surfaced in 1978, sealed inside a fireproof envelope discovered behind a disused drawer during courthouse renovations. No one could explain why it had been stored that way. No one could find a matching incident report. And no one could explain why, within months of the photograph being taken, the entire Halloway family simply vanished. 3 official documents attempt to explain their disappearance. 3 entirely different causes. None of them mention a fire. To understand the weight of the photograph, you have to understand the place it came from. Rural Briar County, Pennsylvania, in the late 19th century was a coal town caught between prosperity and exhaustion. The mines had begun their slow decline, leaving behind families who lived by the rhythm of the land and the stubborn hope that the next seam might deliver one more good year. Dirt roads cut through fields of rye and sorghum, and the courthouse in the center of town stood as the one reliable point of record in a community constantly shifting with the demands of work, weather, and survival. The Halloway family lived a few miles west of that courthouse, on a 30-acre plot bordered by pine and shale. Thomas Halloway, a second-generation farmer, was known in the township ledgers for producing modest yields of grain and keeping a small herd of dairy cattle. His wife Margaret appears frequently in church attendance logs from 1884 through 1891, nearly always listed with her children: Clara, the eldest, James and Henry, the middle boys, and little Sarah, who had only just turned 4 the spring the portrait was taken. They were, by every surviving record, an unremarkable family in an unremarkable place. But the portrait taken on June 3, 1891, gives them an unexpected permanence. It was captured by Edgar W. Langford, a traveling photographer whose presence in the region is well documented. Langford kept detailed ledgers from 1887 to 1892, noting the families he photographed, the fees he collected, and occasional comments on lighting, weather, or the condition of a home. His handwriting confirms the visit to the Halloway farm, though he never recorded anything unusual about it. When researchers pull the official 1891 courthouse inventory, however, something strange appears. The Halloway portrait is listed as damaged by fire, an annotation squeezed between entries for property maps and tax receipts. But the courthouse has no documented fire that year, nor any later reconstruction notes that would suggest partial damage. The anomaly was unnoticed until 1978, when an archivist sorting through mislabeled materials questioned the description. The discoloration on the photograph did not resemble aging, mildew, or chemical deterioration. It looked like heat exposure, targeted, selective, and inconsistent with the era's common storage issues. My role in this is not to prove a legend, but to sift the evidence. Microfilm reels, property deeds, coroner notes, and a small box of Langford's undeveloped glass plates, found decades later in the attic of his final home, formed the backbone of what follows. Rural records from the 1800s can be inconsistent, but fires were always logged due to insurance requirements. Yet after June 1891, every trace of the Halloways simply stops.
The first real cracks in the official story appear not in dramatic accounts or forgotten testimonies, but in something far more mundane: the 1891 census notes. The census worker assigned to Briar County that year, a man named Jonathan Pierce, listed the Halloways as present during his early summer rounds. But sometime later, someone, likely Pierce himself, drew a thin pencil line through the family's entry. No explanation, no correction, no annotation, just a quiet erasure, the kind that archivists say usually signals a revisit, a death, or a relocation. Yet none of those possibilities appear in the logs that follow. It is the earliest indication that the Halloways' status in the community shifted abruptly and inexplicably after June of that year. The second clue emerges from a letter dated August 11, 1891, written by a neighbor named Mrs. Lorena Bishop. In her looping handwriting, she mentions the night the sky lit red over the Halloway Ridge. She doesn't elaborate, doesn't describe destruction, doesn't mention flames touching any buildings. She simply notes it as something that disturbed her livestock and kept her awake until dawn. But this later stands entirely alone in the historical record. There were no fire brigade responses logged that night, no sermons or prayer requests referencing damage or loss, no newspaper entries in the Briar County Herald. It is as if whatever she witnessed existed only long enough for her to write about it, then vanished from every public record. Other contradictions begin to form a pattern. The local school register for the summer and fall terms of 1891 lists all 4 Halloway children absent under the vague notation, family emergency. Teachers sometimes used that phrase when a parent was ill or crops required harvesting help, but such absences usually ended within a week or 2. The Halloway entries remain marked for the entire season, with no return date and no subsequent update. It is another thread that stops abruptly, refusing to tie itself back into the daily life of the community. Then there is the curious portrait delivery receipt. Langford's ledger indicates he returned to the Halloway farm on June 15th to deliver the finished portrait, collecting the remaining payment of 50 cents. But his journal entry for that same day contains a strange observation. He describes the family as worried, distracted, mother packing items for travel. The contradiction hangs heavily. Why would a family preparing to leave be concerned with receiving a framed portrait? And if they were planning a journey, why did they never appear in any departure logs, church farewells, or wagon registry notes? The portrait itself begins revealing early anomalies long before any scientific analysis. When examined closely, the shadow behind Margaret Halloway falls in a direction that does not match the flame of the nearby oil lamp. Light should move uniformly. It should obey the physics Langford meticulously adhered to. Instead, her shadow stretches slightly toward the children, as though a separate light source, one not present in Langford's journal notes, was cast behind her. Another detail emerges: a faint smudge across Thomas Halloway's right shoulder. At first, it appears to be dust or chemical residue, but under magnification, its texture resembles soot, a substance that should not be present if the photograph was taken under normal conditions. By the time restoration specialists study the image in the late 20th century, they reach another unsettling conclusion. The darkening along the edges does not match the chaotic, uneven burn pattern of a true fire. Instead, the discoloration appears selective, affecting portions of the photograph as though exposed to intense heat without open flame. One expert described it as heat that chose. Piece by piece, the contradictions grow heavier. Census edits, letters of a red sky, school absences, a photographer's uneasy observations, and most hauntingly, a portrait that seems to contain smoke before any known fire ever touched the land. It suggests that whatever happened on the Halloway property during the summer of 1891 began revealing itself before anyone understood what they were truly seeing. The investigation shifts meaningfully in 1992, when a small box labeled Langford Personal Effects is discovered during the clearing of an estate in Elk County. Inside, wrapped in brittle newspaper, are several of Edgar W. Langford's original glass photographic plates, the last surviving materials from his career. Archivists examining them quickly realized the collection includes plates from the summer of 1891. But it is what's missing that captures their attention. Of the plates corresponding to the Halloway portrait session, 2 are gone entirely. The catalog numbers skip abruptly as though someone removed them years earlier with deliberate intent. A third plate, long assumed to be blank due to a nearly invisible surface haze, reveals faint markings once scanned under enhanced light. What emerges is not a complete photograph, but a double-exposure trace, fragile and ghost-like, suggesting Langford attempted multiple captures of the Halloway family, something he rarely did unless a session went terribly wrong. Forensic photographic specialists study the artifacts over several months. Their first observation is subtle but telling. The exposure levels differ sharply between family members, almost as if the children were illuminated by a slightly brighter source than the parents. This is unusual for Langford, whose daytime portraits typically maintain even natural lighting. The second anomaly lies in the barely visible background of the recovered plate. Under magnification, experts identify what looks like the silhouette of a collapsed structure, a shape inconsistent with the known condition of the Halloway home in early June 1891. Property surveys taken later that same year described the farm buildings as intact. The outline on the glass plate, however, resembles a roof bowed inward, leaning as though weakened by heat. The third finding is even harder to reconcile. Portions of the undeveloped plate show heat warping, rippling channels in the emulsion usually associated with flash powder misfires. But Langford was known for his avoidance of flash during outdoor or daytime photography. The weather journal he kept, preserved in fragments, notes the June 3rd session took place under clear skies, light wind. No flash would have been needed, no flash was mentioned. Yet the plate behaves as if exposed to sudden, intense heat at very close range. Archivists uncover more when reviewing Langford's surviving correspondence. Among the faded letters is a brief exchange between Langford and his assistant, dated late 1891. 2 lines stand out. The first, "I regret the ruined negatives from the Halloway farm." The second, "I cannot understand the heat that shouldn't have been there." The phrasing is restrained, but unmistakably troubled. Langford does not clarify what ruined the negatives, nor why heat was present during a routine portrait sitting. But his words echoed the same impossible contradiction found in the photograph itself: burn-like damage without any documented fire. Attention then turns to the property records. The Halloway farm appears in the county insurance filings twice in the span of 3 months. The first entry is a standard agricultural policy. The second, however, is unusual, a supplemental rider typically reserved for high-risk industrial sites, mills, foundries, and facilities with volatile equipment. For a family farm with a simple wood frame house and a small barn, the additional policy makes no sense. Insurance historians reviewing the filing confirm the rider was rarely approved without evidence of significant fire risk,
Yet the Halloways had no machinery capable of generating such hazards. The presence of the writer suggests either an undisclosed threat on the property or a forewarning of something approaching. The record inconsistencies deepen with the examination of county coroner ledgers. One ledger from early autumn 1891 includes a cryptic notation beside the Halloway surname, "No remains recovered." But a second version of that same page, created several months later during a process of transcription and preservation, replaces the line entirely with the gentler phrase, "family relocated." The rest of the entries on the page match perfectly, suggesting the revision was intentional. The question becomes, why would a notation about missing remains be softened into a claim of relocation, and who authorized the change? The most unsettling evidence arrives from a misfiled evidence box discovered in 2004 beneath a shelf of unrelated probate documents. Its label carries the surname Hollander, but the contents clearly belong to the Halloway investigation. Inside is a charred piece of plank flooring, the wood blackened, yet recognizable as part of a residential structure. Fire investigators later identify it as flooring consistent with a farm kitchen of the period. Alongside it are several metal fragments.
For decades, the Halloway portrait was treated as a curiosity, an odd photograph with stranger paperwork behind it. But the real breakthrough would come not from modern investigation, but from the brittle pages of a dying man's memory. In the winter of 1914, just weeks before his death, Edgar W. Langford, by then an aging, near-forgotten photographer, gave a recorded interview to a regional folklore researcher. The notes survived in a private collection, surfacing only when the archivist's grandson donated them to the Briar County Historical Society in 2009. Langford's recollection of the Halloway session was different from any entry in his ledgers or journals. He described it as the only day I smelled burning pine before the shutter opened. The phrasing unsettled historians. What fire? What burning? The family was posed beside their parlor window. The June weather had been mild, and Langford's records show he used no flash powder, not that flash powder could produce a scent like burning pine. The oddity seemed, at first, like the product of an elderly man's failing mind, but the detail persisted across two separate versions of the interview transcript. Langford insisted the air was heavy and warm, like a stove with its door ajar, and claimed he paused twice before taking the photograph because the mother, Margaret, kept glancing behind him toward the yard, distracted by something he couldn't see. This single recollection ignited a new wave of investigation. Atmospheric historians were brought in to examine local meteorological journals from the 1890s, entries kept by coal mine supervisors, rail operators, and rural telegraph offices. Their findings were startling. Beginning in mid-July 1891, Briar County experienced a series of short-lived thermal pockets, localized zones of intense heat that came and went with no documented source. Miners described sudden waves of hot air rising from old shafts. Track engineers reported equipment warming to the touch at night. One telegraph operator noted that the wooden floor of his office became hot enough to make one stand rather than sit. The pattern wasn't widespread. It was concentrated in a narrow corridor, one that, decades later, researchers mapped directly through the Halloway property. The breakthrough continued when researchers uncovered a private letter written by Elias Cottrell, a farmhand who lived on the neighboring property in 1891. The letter had been tucked inside a family Bible, only discovered when descendants sold the estate contents at auction. In a shaky hand, Elias described a low roar like a furnace door thrown open on the night the Halloways vanished, followed by a bright red glow behind the tree line. He wrote that he wanted to investigate but had been told firmly by Sheriff Dempsey to stay inside and mind my own. That line became crucial. Sheriff Dempsey's logs for that same night contained no entries, not even a note of patrol. But a later page in the same ledger, from 2 weeks afterwards, referenced excessive community anxiety regarding the June incident. What June incident? The county records held no trace of one. Piece by piece, contradictions began aligning into a pattern that resembled not confusion, but concealment. Insurance documents from 1891 revealed that Thomas Halloway had taken out a second policy on his property under a special rider used only for high-risk industrial sites like mills and metalworking shops. There was no reason for a rural family to obtain such coverage. The insurer had approved the policy without inspection, marking the paperwork recommended by county office. But no one could determine which office or official made the recommendation. At the same time, two versions of the same coroner's ledger page surfaced. The earlier one, preserved on brittle microfilm, listed "no remains recovered, site considered unsafe." The later, cleaner version, filed months afterwards, simply read "family relocated." The handwriting differed, the ink differed, the explanations differed. No relocation records were ever found. But the most startling discovery came from Langford's personal belongings. While cataloging items from his estate, archivists found a duplicate Halloway portrait inside an envelope labeled "Reference Only." Unlike the public version, this print was undamaged, no soot standing, no heat warping, and the angle was slightly wider. The left edge showed part of the yard through the window, where a faint haze, soft but unmistakably rising, could be seen drifting upward. This haze wasn't photographic damage. It had depth, translucence, and shape. The structure behind it, barely visible through the smoke, did not match any map or drawing of the property from June 1891. It resembled the outline of a collapsed shed or a partially burned lean-to, but such a structure did not exist until the night the family disappeared. The realization hit the investigative team with quiet force. The portrait did not document a peaceful family moment. It captured the first visible traces of a disaster unfolding, smoke rising before any official record acknowledged a fire. It was the last image taken before an event so thoroughly erased that only fragmented traces remained scattered across ledgers, letters, and memories. As evidence converged, Langford's final interview, atmospheric anomalies, insurance irregularities, missing negatives, altered coroner records, a chilling question emerged not from what happened, but from what didn't appear anywhere. If the fire was real, if the smoke in the portrait was real, if neighbors saw the sky glow red, then who erased the event from history? And what exactly were they trying to keep hidden? For over a century, the Halloway mystery rested on incomplete ledgers, altered notes, and a photograph that seemed to show too much and too little at the same time. But the greatest revelation appeared unexpectedly in 2003, when the new owners of the long-abandoned Halloway farm began a modest restoration project. During foundation repairs, contractors struck a hollow section beneath the parlor, one not indicated on any surviving property map. At first they assumed it was an abandoned root cellar, but when they opened the collapsed entrance, the stale scent of burnt timber drifted upward, as if the air inside had been sealed for a lifetime. What they uncovered would become the most critical piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The hidden cellar contained the blackened remains of structural beams, charred but intact enough to date through dendrochronology. These beams matched the build period of the house and showed signs of intense heat exposure, far beyond what a simple household fire could produce. Near them, researchers found crockery fused at the edges, its glaze sealed by temperatures high enough to warp ceramic, but not high enough to destroy it completely. This type of heat sealing is rare, typically associated with enclosed burn environments where oxygen is limited and heat cannot escape. Instead, they radiate heat upward, warming soil, foundations, and anything built above them. In some cases, they can smother entire structures without ever producing a visible blaze. This single explanation accounted for nearly every anomaly. The heat marks on the portrait, consistent with radiating heat, not open flame. The lack of an official firefighting record, because there was no surface fire to fight. The melted pocket watch in the cellar, evidence of intense underground heat. The absence of remains. Coal seam collapses can entomb victims completely, leaving no recoverable traces. The conflicting ledgers, because a disaster caused by geological instability would have threatened property values, coal contracts, and the reputation of Briar County's booming mining economy. Local officials in 1891 had powerful incentives to downplay or erase evidence of a coal seam disaster. Acknowledging it would have required evacuations, halted mining operations, and jeopardized regional investment. In a county dependent on coal revenue, silence was easier than truth. And so the story of the Halloways, whatever they witnessed that June evening, became buried under layers of bureaucratic omission and rewritten history. Their home collapsed into a sink of superheated soil. Their traces were cataloged, corrected, and quietly removed. The portrait remained, but stripped of its context until time and accident restored it. In the end, the chilling truth was stark and undeniable. The fire did happen, not as a towering blaze or roaring inferno, but as a silent, invisible force creeping beneath the earth, shaping the final hours of a family who had no way of understanding what was unfolding beneath their feet. It was a disaster no one in 1891 could fully explain, and one the county chose never to acknowledge. The portrait was the last record of the Halloways standing above a fire that had already begun.
The discovery of the hidden cellar and the second photograph in 2003 did more than complete a century-old mystery. It reopened a wound that many in Briar County never realized was there. Within months, historians, geologists, and archival ethicists were debating the case with a renewed intensity. To some, the portrait became evidence of a rare geological event, an underground coal seam ignition captured at the very moment its effects reached the surface. To others, it stood as an emblem of a deliberately suppressed tragedy, buried not by time, but by coordinated silence. And to a smaller but vocal circle, the inconsistencies throughout the archival chain suggested something else still. An early example of manipulated documentation, where edits and omissions served economic interests more than public truth. Museums throughout Pennsylvania began submitting requests to study or display the original portrait. Some curators argued it represented a natural history anomaly, a visual freeze frame of invisible heat radiating through the ground. Others insisted it belonged in social history galleries, not geological ones, because it told the story of institutional silence rather than natural disaster. The competing interpretations reflected a broader uncertainty. The portrait did not belong neatly to any one discipline, and perhaps that was why it had slipped through the cracks for so long. As public attention grew, longtime Briar County residents came forward with memories passed down quietly through generations. Stories once dismissed as folklore resurfaced, tales of the night the ground breathed heat, of livestock refusing to enter the Halloway pasture, of a brief red glow seen by a handful of neighbors who had no explanation for it. These recollections, once considered exaggerations or misremembered gossip, suddenly seemed consistent with the science of coal seam behavior. For many families, this realization stirred a mix of vindication and unease. Their elders had not imagined these things, they had simply lacked the language to describe what they had witnessed. The Halloway property, once an unremarkable tract of land on the outskirts of town, gradually became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Families who had lost relatives to mining collapses or undocumented industrial accidents visited to leave small tokens: a flower, a miner's cap, a folded note. They saw in the Halloway story a reflection of their own, a reminder of how often working-class tragedies faded from official record while the economic engine of coal moved forward untouched. The emotional ripple extended far beyond Briar County. Descendants of Edgar Langford confronted the uncomfortable possibility that the photographer had known more than he ever admitted. Archivists revisited the ethics of their predecessors, wondering how many small edits, mislabeled folders, or lost ledgers had shaped the version of local history they had inherited.
and townspeople grappled with the knowledge that part of their heritage, celebrated anniversaries, civic narratives, even schoolhouse lessons, stood on ground partially built on concealment. In the end, the portrait's legacy became larger than the mystery it solved. It challenged scholars to reconsider what historical non-events truly were. How many tragedies had been softened, unrecorded, or erased because they threatened the industries that sustained a community? How many photographs, letters, or testimonies still sat in mislabeled boxes, quietly contradicting the official versions of the past? The Halloway portrait, once a curiosity marked simply as recovered after the fire, had forced an entire county to confront the possibility that history is not only what is remembered, but also what is deliberately forgotten. Looking back, what makes the Halloway portrait so haunting is not only what it shows, but what it quietly exposes about the nature of memory. A single image, meant to preserve a family's likeness, became a window into everything their community chose not to confront. In its scorched edges and faint haze, we see the marks of an event erased from official record, yet etched unmistakably into the physical world. The portrait reminds us that history is not a fixed ledger. It is a shifting terrain shaped by those who record it and those who decide what should be left out. The Halloway story forces us to consider how many other families vanished into unspoken tragedies, their fates softened by paperwork, their experiences reduced to administrative edits. It reminds us that silence is not proof of absence, and a missing record is not the same as a missing truth. The photograph endures because it captured something no ledger dared to name, a moment of fear, confusion, and impending loss, preserved in film long after people stopped speaking of it. And in its stubborn survival, it whispers a final truth. Sometimes the past reveals itself not through what we remember, but through what refuses to stay buried.